Hey guys, today I will be talking about what Jesus Christ meant by binding and loosing. Let me read to you Matthew 16 verse 18. And I say also to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now I'm going to read to you Matthew 18:18, where Jesus says, Verily I say to you, whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. I've often heard people say that we can bind demons based on what Jesus Christ says here. However, that is not what Jesus meant when he spoke about binding. I've also heard people say that we can loose certain things into the atmosphere based on what Jesus Christ said in Matthew 16:19 and Matthew 18:18. However, that is not what he meant by binding and loosing. I know that this will come as a shock to a lot of people. I've been to many church services where I've heard believers, even pastors, say things like, I bind you, Satan, or I bind you, demon. I've even heard some people bind emotional things like anger, lust, jealousy. Now, how can we know what Jesus meant by binding and loosing? Answer, by looking at the context of what is being said. Whenever people take the word of God out of context, they are bound to make a mistake when it comes to properly interpreting the word of God. So let's see, what is the literal context of Matthew 16 verse 18? And then we're going to see what is the literal context of Matthew 18:18. I am not going to read those entire passages, but I will tell you what the literal context is. Matthew 16:18 is found in the passage of Matthew where Jesus Christ is having a conversation with Peter after he asked Peter and other disciples, who do people say that he is? And then we see that the apostle Peter says to Jesus that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, remember that later on because it will be important. The context of Matthew 18:18 is Jesus Christ is talking about matters of church discipline. As a matter of fact, the entire chapter 18 of Matthew has to do with humility, because in that chapter, we see that there is a problem among the disciples in which they are arguing about who is going to be reigning with Jesus Christ. So in this chapter, Jesus Christ teaches them a lesson of humility. And he talks about how to deal with someone in the church who has erred. More specifically, he talks about how and when to use witnesses to correct someone who is not receiving correction. Please remember that because it will be important to understanding what Jesus Christ is saying. So now, down to the question, what did Jesus mean by binding and loosing? Well, what I just told you about the literal context of Matthew 16:18 and Matthew 18:18 gives you a clue. For one, he cannot be talking about binding evil spirits and losing things into the atmosphere. The reason why I say that is because, like we just learned, the literal context of Matthew 16:18 lets us know that Jesus was having a conversation with Peter, and he was talking with Peter about establishing his church and it being built upon the rock, which is himself. And in Matthew 18:18, Jesus Christ is talking about matters of church discipline. Now, there are times in the Bible, just like in today's time, where the words binding and loosing do mean keeping things bound, as in like in chains or tied with a rope, or losing something into the air like a virus, or letting your dog loose. However, in the context of those two verses, that is not what it means. And as believers, like I said earlier, we must study the Word of God according to His will. That means that we need to be responsible stewards of His Word. That means that we need to do our research. So here is what Jesus Christ meant by binding and loosing. And this is where the historical context of the book of Matthew, we're talking about the time of Jesus, we're talking about the 1st century AD, comes in handy. Earlier, we looked at the literal context of Matthew 16:18 and Matthew 18:18. And we learned that based on the literal context alone, we cannot say that Jesus Christ was talking about binding evil spirits and losing things into the atmosphere. When we look at the historical context of the time in which the Gospel of Matthew was written, we learned that the phrase bind and loose was used at that time to declare things lawful or unlawful by people like the rabbis, the scribes and Pharisees, the Sadducees, the teachers of the law, etc. So, for example, whenever they would get together and they would agree that something was unlawful based on the law of God or the laws which they had made, which they claimed to protect the law of God, the way that they would do that is they would say that is bound. So at the time when somebody wanted to say that something was unlawful according to either the law of God or the laws that other people had created to supposedly protect the law of God, was by saying that it was bound. When they wanted to say that something was good, that it was not against the law of God, that it was permissible, the way that they would do that is they would say that it was loosed. So, for example, let's say that they wanted to say that it was okay for somebody to do a certain activity on the Sabbath. They would then say that that activity was loosed, and they will say according to who or what.